Welcome to the debate. When the Chinese foreign minister visits Pyongyang, intelligence analysts in Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo, they don't just watch the handshakes on the tarmac.
No, definitely not.
Right. They analyze every single adjective, every subtle phrasing, and every punctuation mark published in the state newspaper the next morning. Because in international diplomacy, and specifically when dealing with opaque regimes, a single word change can be the difference between routine maintenance of a relationship and, well, a total structural renovation of a global alliance.
Exactly. You are constantly trying to figure out if you're looking at like a fresh coat of rhetorical paint or if the actual load-bearing columns of the geopolitical order are shifting right in front of you.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It really is, and it's incredibly difficult to parse because the language of diplomacy is specifically designed to sound monumental, even when absolutely nothing has changed.
Which brings us to the blueprint we are examining today. We are looking at the weekend reports from North Korea's official state media, KCNA, detailing a high-level Friday meeting in Pyongyang between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi.
Right, the Friday summit.
Yeah. And the central question we have to answer is this. Does this specific diplomatic meeting and the highly coordinated rhetoric surrounding it represent a substantive, escalating strategic alignment between these two nations? Or is it simply a performative reaffirmation of a long-standing, completely unchanged partnership?
The stakes on this are massive because if it's the former, the global security map is fundamentally changing. But to be clear on where I stand, my position is that this exchange relies on standard diplomatic phrasing and baseline agreements typical of traditional allies, indicating deep continuity rather than a new paradigm.
And I completely disagree. My position is that the explicit, mutual backing on geopolitical issues signals a concrete, new phase of strategic alignment between Beijing and Pyongyang.
So you're firmly in the structural renovation camp.
I am. I read those exact same reports from Friday's meeting, and I see a highly significant event. To me, it demonstrates an active operationalizing of a unified front. I mean, they are moving beyond their historical ties into active global coordination. You look at Foreign Minister Wang Yi's specific language that relations are entering a new phase following a summit last year. That isn't accidental.
Well, sure. In state media, there are no accidents.
Right, so when Kim Jong-un isn't just welcoming a neighbor, but explicitly adopting and backing China's broader global framework by pushing for a, quote, multipolar world and offering full support for Beijing's territorial integrity, that is a profound shift.
See, I hear that, but looking at the text, I see this exchange relying almost entirely on standard diplomatic theater. The text explicitly identifies them as traditional allies.
It does, yes.
In supporting the One China principle, the official position that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China's territory. That is the absolute baseline requirement for any ally of Beijing. It's not some groundbreaking concession.
But the rhetoric...
Let me just finish this thought. When Wang Yi comes to town for a 2-day trip, the diplomatic protocols inherently demand a narrative of forward momentum. Frame Wang Yi's trip and the new phase rhetoric as customary diplomatic flattery. You cannot dispatch the Chinese foreign minister to a neighboring ally and have the subsequent press release say, "We met and everything remains exactly as it was."
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how timelines function in diplomatic rhetoric. Let's step out of geopolitics for a second and compare this to the corporate world.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think of two massive companies that have collaborated for decades as preferred vendors, right? They are traditional allies in the market. A conceptual handshake exists.
Sure.
But when the leadership publicly announces they are entering a new phase that is built upon a specific executive summit from last year, that is the language of a corporate merger moving into operational integration. They are citing a past event as the catalyst for current, tangible changes.
But that's a corporate analogy. Diplomacy is...
But the mechanics of the language are the same. Wang Yi is an incredibly disciplined diplomat. He does not use temporal markers lightly. He explicitly tied the current momentum to last year's summit. How can you dismiss that specific timeline as mere diplomatic flattery?
It creates an undeniable chain of cause and effect.
Because the cause and effect you are describing doesn't actually contain any new structural obligations. If we stick to your corporate merger analogy,
Which I think holds up perfectly.
well, operational integration means something highly specific. It means combining supply chains, merging accounting departments, sharing proprietary data. You can measure it. In this diplomatic exchange, what is the measurable integration?
It's in the text.
Is it? The timeline Wang Yi references is real. Yes, the summit last year happened. But citing it serves to validate the ongoing dialogue, not to announce a new set of binding treaties.
But that is exactly how these regimes announce integration.
Hold on, let me just clarify this point. When you belong to a traditional alliance, you constantly have to reference recent high-level contact to prove the alliance is being actively maintained. It is the diplomatic equivalent of checking in.
Just keeping the lights on.
Exactly. It prevents the relationship from appearing dormant. China and North Korea actually have a mutual defense treaty dating back to 1961. That is the architecture. When Wang Yi says new phase, he's just slapping a new label on a relationship that has existed in perpetuity simply because they share a border and mutual adversaries.
I would argue the measurable integration you're asking for is found right there in the synchronized messaging. You can't have a new phase without a shared vocabulary, and that is exactly what KCNA broadcasted.
You mean the multipolar world stuff?
Yes, the state media reports explicitly highlight Kim Jong-un pushing for a multipolar world. For anyone listening, when China or Russia use the term multipolar, they essentially mean a world order where the United States doesn't get to call all the shots.
Right. It's a direct counter to the concept of American hegemony. Power is divided among regional heavyweights.
Exactly. And historically, North Korea's propaganda apparatus is intensely insular. Their entire state ideology is juche, which translates to extreme self-reliance. They focus almost entirely on localized deterrence on the Korean peninsula.
They do tend to stay in their own backyard rhetorically.
Right. So when North Korean state media officially broadcasts Kim Jong-un's adopting the exact terminology of Beijing's grand global strategy, that is a highly coordinated messaging strategy. North Korea is actively inserting itself into a global narrative. They are operationalizing the alliance by merging their public diplomatic postures to project power far beyond their own borders.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The phrase multipolar world is not some highly sensitive, tightly controlled proprietary doctrine. It is a widely used generic buzzword for virtually any nation that finds itself aligned against Western interests.
I wouldn't call it generic.
It is practically a reflex at this point. When Kim Jong-un adopts that phrase during a visit from the Chinese foreign minister, it is just standard diplomatic hospitality. You mirror the talking points of your honored guest. It is the equivalent of a host serving a guest their favorite tea.
Tea? Really?
Yes. It shows respect, it ensures the meeting goes smoothly, but serving someone tea does not mean the host is fundamentally altering their own daily diet.
Okay, that tea analogy is a very dismissive reading of how state media operates, particularly a machine as paranoid and precise as KCNA.
I'm not dismissing KCNA's precision.
But there is no off-the-cuff hospitality in a KCNA weekend report. Every single syllable is scrutinized, vetted by top officials, and deployed for a specific strategic purpose. If they broadcast that Kim Jong-un is backing the push for a multipolar world, it's not to be polite. It is because the regime wants Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo to know that Pyongyang now considers itself an active participant in China's broader geopolitical bloc.
But is it actually participating?
I think it absolutely is. Let me give you a better analogy. This isn't about serving tea. It's more like a fiercely independent local business suddenly adopting the national corporate branding of a conglomerate.
Okay.
It signals a willingness to trade some of that fierce independence, that juche ideology we talked about, in exchange for the protection of a larger entity. They are moving away from merely being a regional security headache and positioning themselves as an integrated node in a larger, global counterorder. That is far more significant than mirroring a guest's talking points.
But is it actually a shift in underlying strategy or just a shift in the audience they're trolling?
I don't think it's just trolling.
You are completely correct that KCNA is meticulous. but we have to understand what that meticulousness is aimed at. It is almost always aimed at creating the perception of vast geopolitical weight for domestic and international audiences. By using China's buzzwords, Kim Jong-un elevates his own status.
Sure, he looks bigger.
Exactly. He makes himself appear to be a co-architect of this grand multipolar world alongside Xi Jinping, rather than a junior partner in a localized dispute.
Which benefits both of them, right?
It's mutually beneficial theater, yes. China gets to show the world that its vision has international backing, and North Korea gets to sound like a global heavyweight. But operationally, underneath that rhetoric, North Korea's actual military and economic calculus remains entirely focused on its own regime survival and its immediate borders.
I disagree.
I just haven't seen any evidence that North Korea is actually deploying resources to reshape the global order outside of their immediate neighborhood.
I think you are artificially separating rhetoric from reality here. In international relations, clearly stated public commitments constrain future behavior. The words actually become the reality, and that brings us to the most concrete pledge in the report, which I think proves this is more than theater.
You're talking about the Taiwan comment.
Yes. During this Friday meeting, Kim's government pledged to fully support Chinese efforts to achieve territorial integrity.
Right.
The text goes out of its way to define this as the One China principle, the official position that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China's territory. Explicitly framing this on the world stage during Wang Yi's visit is a highly calculated geopolitical maneuver. It locks in mutual support.
But that's just...
By firmly planting his flag on China's most sensitive, critical core issue, Kim Jong-un is demanding reciprocal backing for his own core issues on the Korean Peninsula. This isn't just an exchange of pleasantries, it is a transactional alignment of red lines.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered whether there is any plausible scenario where Kim Jong-un wouldn't express support for the One China principle during a visit from Wang Yi?
Well, he could simply remain silent on it in the official readout. He didn't have to highlight it.
I genuinely don't think he could. Because the reality of Beijing's diplomacy is that absolute adherence to the One China principle is a prerequisite for any relationship whatsoever. It is their official position, non-negotiable.
Right, it's foundational.
If a traditional ally were to host the Chinese foreign minister and say absolutely nothing about Taiwan, or worse, offer some nuanced take on territorial integrity, it would trigger an immediate diplomatic crisis.
Sure, a crisis, but
Therefore, pledging full support to this principle is simply the cost of entry for hosting the meeting. It is paying the toll. You cannot point to someone paying a mandatory toll on a highway and call it a newly forged weapon of alliance. It is the baseline expectation of the relationship.
But there is a massive difference between tacitly accepting a baseline behind closed doors and proactively centering it in your global state media broadcast of the meeting. Yes, recognizing the One China principle is a prerequisite for diplomatic ties with Beijing. I concede that.
Right.
But KCNA did not have to make it a focal point of their weekend report summarizing the summit. They chose to explicitly highlight the pledge to fully support efforts to achieve territorial integrity.
Because it pleases Beijing.
It does more than please Beijing. We have to look at the global context here. In the current geopolitical climate, where tensions in the Taiwan Strait are a daily topic of global security analysis, choosing to amplify that specific prerequisite is a strategic choice. Let's think about the real-world consequences for a second.
Okay.
It tells the international community, and specifically the Pentagon, that if a conflict arises over Taiwan, the North Korean state has already laid the rhetorical groundwork to support Beijing completely. It raises the terrifying prospect for military planners that North Korea might actively act to pin down U.S. and South Korean forces on the peninsula while China makes a move on Taiwan.
That is a worst-case scenario.
But it completely removes ambiguity. And removing ambiguity is a structural change.
I agree with your premise that removing ambiguity is a structural change, but I completely disagree that there was any ambiguity to begin with.
Really? None?
Has anyone in the international intelligence community genuinely harbored doubts about North Korea's stance on Taiwan? Of course not. They are a deeply reliant, heavily sanctioned neighboring state that has depended on Beijing for economic lifelines, energy, food, and diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council for decades.
I'm not denying the history.
The lack of ambiguity has existed since the Cold War. Highlighting it in the state media report isn't laying new groundwork. It is reminding the audience of the existing foundation. It is Pyongyang saying, we still stand exactly where we have always stood. That is continuity. It is profound, significant continuity, but it is continuity nonetheless.
But continuity alone does not explain the introduction of the new phase phrasing following last year's summit. You keep returning to the idea that because the foundation existed, nothing new is being built on top of it. But diplomatic relationships compound over time.
They do, yes.
Decades of being traditional allies provides the baseline trust necessary to move into operational synchronization today. When they synchronize their language on a multipolar world and emphasize mutual support for territorial integrity at this specific moment in history, they are demonstrating that the alliance is adapting to modern pressures.
I mean, adaptation is a fair term. I will give you that.
The traditional alliance was forged in a different century under the logic of the Cold War. The new phase is the realization that they must act as a fully coordinated, modern bloc to face the current architecture of global sanctions and strategic containment led by the United States.
Adaptation is fair, but adaptation does not necessarily mean escalation or a new phase of integration. Think about it like a building. A building adapts to a harsh winter by turning up the heat, but the architecture of the building hasn't changed.
Okay.
When Wang Yi and Kim Jong-un meet, they are certainly responding to modern pressures. They look at the current geopolitical map, they look at U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific, and they recognize that publicly reinforcing their bonds serves both their immediate interests. But analysts need to be rigorous about what constitutes a shift.
And I think we are seeing one.
But if we analyze the specific mechanisms discussed in the source text, we see broad, sweeping agreements on territorial integrity and generalized support for a multipolar world. What don't we see? We don't see the announcement of joint military commands, we don't see integrated economic zones, we don't see shared technological or nuclear development programs being broadcast.
Not publicly, no.
Right, we see the very precise, very polished language of diplomatic reassurance. It is a highly effective performance of unity, designed to make Western analysts sweat.
So when we look at the whole picture to wrap up here, my position remains that we are seeing something evolutionary. The deliberate language of a new phase, combined with North Korea's active synchronized messaging on a multipolar world and its explicit, highly publicized backing of the One China principle, points to an evolving, active strategic bloc.
So you're sticking to the new paradigm theory.
I am. It is not merely a static historical friendship, playing out on a loop. It is a dynamic alignment where both nations are actively updating their shared architecture to project power and counter mutual adversaries on a global scale, well beyond their own borders.
And coming at it from the other side, my position is that the invocation of their status as traditional allies remains the absolute key to understanding this exchange. The language used, from supporting territorial integrity to mirroring buzzwords about a multipolar world, reveals deep diplomatic continuity.
A fresh coat of paint, as you said.
Exactly. It is the standard, mandatory vocabulary of states aligned with Beijing, disguised by a meticulous state media apparatus as a monumental breakthrough. It is structural maintenance, high-stakes maintenance certainly, but not a new paradigm.
I think one clear area of convergence between our perspectives, though, is the sheer effectiveness of this event. Whether you view this as a structural escalation or just a masterful performance of continuity, we both agree that the Friday meeting and the subsequent Saturday KCNA reports successfully reinforced a strong, unified public posture between Pyongyang and Beijing.
Oh, undoubtedly. The message sent to the rest of the world was undeniably cohesive.
Yeah.
The diplomatic machinery functioned exactly as intended. They presented a seamless, united front. And that really highlights the inherent complexity of parsing state media reports and official diplomatic statements. Intelligence work is rarely a matter of finding a blatant falsehood in these texts.
It's way more subtle than that.
Right. It is about weighing the subtle line between rhetorical continuity and strategic evolution. Words matter deeply, but the context in which those words are deployed, the timeline of visits, the historical weight of the alliance, the economic realities on the ground, that determines their true gravity.
which means evaluating international relations requires us to constantly look past the immediate headlines. We have to be willing to look at the blueprints, inspect the structural beams of these alliances, and ask whether the load-bearing walls have actually shifted, or if we're just reacting to the new paint job.
Exactly.
There is clearly much more to explore in how these traditional alliances adapt to modern global pressures, and how state media telegraphs those adaptations to the rest of the world. Because eventually, the rhetoric broadcast on a Saturday morning translates into the geopolitical reality we all have to live with on Monday.
And that is a reality that will keep analysts and policymakers busy for years to come.
Without a doubt. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.